Good evening and welcome. My name is Ryan Bonfilio and I teach Old Testament at Embry's Candler School of Theology, and I'm also the executive director of the Candler Foundry. We are so glad that you are gathered this evening for Publications, a webinar series hosted by the Candler Foundry at Emory. The Candler Foundry is designed to bring rich opportunities for theological learning and exploration out beyond the walls of our seminary, making them more accessible and engaging for people who might never enroll in seminary. In that spirit, this webinar series is intended to bring newly published academic works to the public square, at least the virtual public square, inviting the broader public into the important conversations that these books engaged. And tonight, we are thrilled and honored to be featuring the book, The Unfinished Search for Common Ground, Reimagining Howard Thurman, which is edited by Dr. Walter Earl Fluker. This book aims to summarize the life and work of Howard Thurman while also stimulating Thurman scholars and readers in their ongoing exploration of his importance and his legacy. With us are the volume's editor, as I said, Dr. Fluker, and three extraordinary panelists whom I'll introduce in just a moment. We'll begin with some brief remarks by Dr. Fluker, and then we'll have about a 20-minute roundtable conversation in which I pose several questions for these four to discuss amongst themselves. Don't think of this as an academic style formal presentation. Rather, you're getting the chance to listen in on the editor talking among his peers and colleagues and fellow contributors to this volume. Then, for the last 20 minutes, you, our audience, will be able to enter into the conversation. You can post comments and questions at any point during the webinar, and we will curate those questions and present them before Dr. Fluker and the other panelists in that final 20 minutes. One final note, the publisher of this volume, Orbis Books, has agreed to offer a 30% discount on this book. All you need to do is use the coupon code or the promo code, which we're going to put forward to you in the comments section of the webinar. Just use that when ordering the book directly from Orbis Books, or you can even call them at 1-800-258-5830. So without further ado, let me introduce our editor, Dr. Walter Earl Fluker. For many here, Dr. Fluker needs no introduction, and if truth be told, a proper introduction of Dr. Fluker would take the whole 60 minutes of this webinar, and so we don't want to do that. Dr. Fluker was formerly the Dean's Professor of Spirituality, Ethics, and Leadership at Candler School of Theology, and prior to arriving at Candler, he served as the Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of Ethical Leadership at Boston University. He is the editor of the Howard Thurman Papers Project and the director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Initiative for the Development of Ethical Leadership, also at Boston University School of Theology. He was founding executive director of the Andrew Young Center for Global Leadership Center and also the Coca-Cola Professor of Leadership Studies at Morehouse College. He is known as an expert in the theory and practice of ethical leadership, and Dr. Fluker is an internationally known consultant, speaker, lecturer, and workshop leader. Dr. Fluker, it is a joy and honor to have you here with us tonight. Let me turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Ryan, and also to Krista and Pearl, who are in the background making all of this work. So many thank yous for everyone, and especially for the Foundry. In your public outreach, the ways in which you seek to educate the public, and this being just one of many different expressions of the work of the Foundry, I'm very grateful to you, and of course to our Dean, Jan Love, and the rest of the faculty. I'm glad tonight to talk a little bit about how this volume came to be. I am the editor of the Howard Thurman Papers Project, and this volume is the product of a collaborative conference last spring held at Candler School of Theology with some of the same persons who were engaged, both as speakers, but also the technicians, and of course, Ryan Bonfiglio. I'm most interested in giving you some sense of how this got started. I was so fortunate as a young seminary student to meet Howard Thurman. And I was the ride that picked him up. You know how students are the ones who are the chauffeurs for distinguished professors and celebrities. Well, I picked him up at the airport, at O'Hare Airport, and drove him to Garrett Theological Seminary. And that short time with Howard Thurman turned into an afternoon where he probed me on my vocation. I had no idea that that moment would blossom into a larger relationship where I would write Thurman and he would write me back. And over time, I was invited to be one among 10 other students who were part of a larger project sponsored by the Lilly Endowment to meet with Thurman and to listen to his wisdom for an entire week. I can only tell you that as we sat with this wise old sage during his last years, all I could do was write poetry. Poetry flowed out of my spirit like libations. All of us were enraptured by Thurman, but for him, it was absolute play. He had so much fun with us, so that at the end of our time with him in the late 70s, we begged to stay with him in San Francisco at the Howard Thurman Educational Trust. And he literally spat out his coffee laughing. Everything for Thurman was serious, but it was not as serious. He often said, don't take life seriously, live it seriously. And as I've said in other places, it's the gift of great mystics like Thurman who are able to take life seriously, but yet not take it so seriously, especially ourselves. Tonight is really the consummation of over 30 years of work on Howard Thurman as the editor. We have produced a 5 volume documentary edition on Howard Thurman. uh, my team with the Howard Thurman Papers Project. Two of those are represented tonight here in this panel. But there are also 5 other uh, volumes that have been produced by the Howard Thurman Papers Project since 1992 and at various locations, including Colgate Rochester Divinity School, Morehouse College, and last but not least, Boston University. I'm also so honored to have Luther Smith with us tonight, who has served as senior editor for from the beginning and even before as a mentor and guide. Peter Eisenstadt, who has been my partner in crime and in wonder for the past 30 plus years, and who is also the distinguished biographer of Hounds of Hell, a project which he began as one of the associate editors of the Howard Thurman Papers Project. And certainly, my sister beloved, my colleague at Boston University, Dr. Shively Smith, has been with me arm in arm since we met at the Haley Farm some years ago. Little did we know that we would end up teaching on the same faculty at Boston University and that she would find her way into Thurman and would blossom like a palm tree in Lebanon. I'm so grateful to have Dr. Shively Smith with us. Very briefly, in the volume, I introduced the work of the Papers Project over 30 years. Our former managing editor of the Papers Project, Sylvia Glick, calls it the wide and what is it, the rambling road. It was indeed where there were ups and downs and fresh starts. And I can tell you literally, there were days I was ready to let it go or turn it over to someone else whom I thought might be more capable. But the words of Thurman have stayed with me over the years. These are simple words which you've heard before, but for me, they still resonate with deep meaning. He told me to wait and listen for the sound of the genuine that is within me. And that when I would hear it, that would be my voice, and that would be the voice of God. When he first wrote that to me in a letter, I had no idea what he was talking about. But over the past 30 plus years and even more, that sound has visited me. And when it does, I know in some sense who I am. I also have a good sense that what I'm supposed to do is to make sure that Thurman's work is spread to many. And that has been my vision since the inception of the project. That is to disseminate the large record of Howard Thurman. We've only published, if I'm correct, 7% of the vast repository of records and documents with Thurman, which totals over 58,000 documents. If I had known when I started, I would not have taken this on. But this is the trick of life, and I think the trick of spirit. We're always pulled in to things that we can only imagine. And this is the reason why I thought it appropriate that we hold a conference at Candler on last spring and talk about reimagining Howard Thurman. There's a burgeoning interest in Thurman around the globe, and there are scholars, activists, spiritual practitioners, and so many others who are looking for new and fresh meaning out of their own religious traditions. And the least of these has been those who are part of the larger Christian traditions among Jews, and more recently among some Islamic scholars with whom I've worked, and Buddhists. Thurman speaks in an incredibly powerful way to the human spirit, which is always looking for something that it can never quite name. And Thurman gave a name to this, but he was so aware that this name was inadequate. He called it, he called her, he called him, he called this and that God. And this is part of the work of reimagining Thurman for our time. Briefly, and I'll leave this for the rest of the group to talk about. The volume has three different sections. One is devoted to spirituality and social transformation, which has been a key concern of mine as a Thurman scholar. How do you bring spirit and social transformation together? How do we create one fluid moment in which, though they are different in some ways, we are still part of the same stream of consciousness? Thurman, I think, provides some very powerful and interesting answers. Two, what is the relationship of Thurman's corpus, his many writings, sermons, speeches, to the question of the church or religious institutions and public life? Is it just in religious institutions that we find God or spirit, or are there non ecclesial spaces or spaces that we've not even been able to name yet where God is so abundantly manifest and calling us to work and labor and care and compassion? And finally, the third section of the volume is devoted to Howard Thurman and democratic life and practices. At this critical impasse, not just in the United States of America, but around the globe, where there are incredible issues that endanger the very experiment of democracy, Thurman has a word. And I've learned over time to listen deeply to what he's saying, what he said, and what we are called to be and do in the work of creating democratic spaces, not just in society, but in our religious institutions, in our own personal and private relationships with others, and most of all, in this incredible creation of which we are part. I'm speaking specifically to the natural environment and the incredible crisis that confronts us as human beings. and the need for both human and non-human flourishing. So the volume is set up in that way, Ryan and others, as a way of entrance into the vast territory, which is Howard Washington Thurman. Thanks for letting me speak to this.
Well, Dr. Fluker, thank you. Dr. Fluker, thank you for those comments and for framing this book for us. It makes me, and I'm certain many others in the room with you, just all the more eager to engage, not just this work, but the work of Thurman more broadly. We want to enter now into a period of conversation between Dr. Fluker and 3 panelists. Now, let me say before I introduce them that by my count, there were 14 contributors to this volume, and then many more that we can imagine who have worked with Howard Thurman and his theology over the years. The 3 that we have in the room today are here with us because A, we thought having 14 panelists might make for a 4-hour webinar, which would be just a bit too long for a Tuesday evening, but also because all 3 of these individuals have close proximity to Candler. Luther Smith, of course, as a long beloved professor at Candler, Shively Smith as a graduate from Emory, and then Peter Eisenstadt, Walter Fluker. I can't imagine doing an event with you that did not include Peter. So let me briefly
Peter
now
can't imagine it either.
Yeah, that's right. Let me briefly introduce those panelists with us. Our first panelist is Dr. Luther E. Smith, Jr., the Professor Emeritus of Church and Community at Candler School of Theology. Dr. Smith's current research focuses on the writing and correspondence of, you guessed it, Howard Thurman, advocacy on behalf of children, and a spirituality of hope. Dr. Smith is an ordained elder in the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church and one of the most beloved teachers at Candler for the past several decades. Our second panelist is Reverend Dr. Shively T.J. Smith, who serves as Assistant Professor of New Testament at Boston University School of Theology. She is also the inaugural director of the school's PhD program. Dr. Smith completed her PhD in New Testament Studies at Emory University, publishing her first book called Strangers to Family, Diaspora and First Peter's Invention of God's Household with Baylor University Press. As a scholar of the New Testament, Smith focuses on the traditions of Peter and the general letters of the New Testament, as well as diaspora studies, womanist and African American biblical interpretation, and, of course, Howard Thurman. Our third panelist is Dr. Peter Eisenstadt, who is an affiliate scholar in the Department of History at Clemson University. He has a PhD in history from NYU. He is the author or editor of 6 books, including Rockdale Village, Encyclopedia of African American Culture and History, and Black Conservatism, and of course, Against the Hounds of Hell, A Life of Howard Thurman. He was associate editor of the Howard Thurman Papers Project and has worked closely with Dr. Fluker in numerous events and on numerous projects. We're delighted to have all 3 of you here. I want to get things started by offering a rather general prompt that I want to invite you all to respond to briefly. And the prompt is simply this: what is one insight, maybe one aha moment that you've had from this volume that you think is most important for the church or the world, or maybe even your own work at the present moment? So one insight that you think is the most important for the church, the world, or your own work. So, Dr. Shively Smith, can I invite you to start, and then we'll just enter into a free-flowing conversation from there.
Yeah, absolutely. First, so thank you so much for inviting me to this space. I always love being on panels with these guys and talking Howard Thurman on top of it. So it's such a gift to do so. And at my own alma mater, I'm grateful. You know, one of the things that I think is a real gift for the volume is, in fact, the 3 sections that Walter, that you organized the book in. I think it really is magnificent just to look at the table of contents and realize that these are 3 clear entryways into Thurman that in many ways, a lot of times in one person's life, one door takes up the entirety of their life, be it focus solely on the spiritual life, but you forget the democratic life, or focus solely on the ecclesial life, but you don't pay attention to the non-ecclesial life. So the idea that Thurman creates space and has such a range, that there are 3 different ways in which to work your way in and out of Thurman, to me, is a real gift of this volume and a real opportunity.
I'm so glad you asked for Shively to go first. It gave me time to think about how to answer this question. I'm taken with a variety of disciplines that are engaging Thurman. It's easy to take someone who is a scholar and a significant figure and to basically attempt to interpret them through a single discipline, political science or theology or philosophy. And I think all of those disciplines are appropriate for engaging Thurman, but Thurman's mind was so much of a multidiscipline mind. This is how he basically sought to interpret reality and meaning and purpose. And he wrote in these ways. His book, The Search for Common Ground, is dealing with scientific data about matters that he interprets as evidence for common ground. It's this breadth of his, I think, spirit, of his mind that is very modern. And at the same time, I think there's so many in the modern world who do not get it, who still only continue to think in terms of a single discipline. And the volume presents, I think, the multidisciplinary understanding of Thurman.
That's right.
Well, I'm glad I went third. I mean, more time than Luther to think about it. You know, my contribution to the volume was about Thurman and fear. And anybody who has read Jesus Disinherited knows how central fear is for understanding Thurman. And as Luther said, it's an interdisciplinary fear. Thurman was opposed to religious fear and the long history of religion that try to frighten people. He was opposed to community fear, being afraid of outsiders and thinking you can create a community by excluding people, and political fear. And particularly, I mean, Thurman was concerned about the fear that African Americans had in a racist society. And the civil rights movement was, as he wrote, what was so striking about it was that Black people overcame fear, and in a massive way, in a way that could not be done by one person. And his theory of nonviolence, which is central to understanding Thurman, is overcoming fear, as I think is in two parts. Is the disinherited need to overcome their fear, and they somehow need to overcome the fears of the powerful, the people that are the oppressors, that they're going to lose everything. And, you know, I think in the United States, in the world, the first part worked. We're still working out the second. And America is still caught in fear and transfixed by fear in ways that maybe are as bad as it was 60, 70 years ago. And I think Thurman has a lot to say about how we're dealing with fear of others in the world today.
Well, thank you all for that. I want to kick it to you on this as well, Dr. Fluker. I mean, you have spent a career's worth of studying Howard Thurman, and yet I wonder, as this volume comes together, was there any new insight or moment for you where something came into focus, or you noticed something about Howard Thurman's work or his legacy that maybe wasn't quite in place for you before?
Thanks for asking that question. I would add that another contribution of the volume is the interreligious dialogue and practice that is evident in the essays by Orr Rose, Extending Hospitality, and Rabbi Rose, of course, is from Hebrew traditions. The other is his Lopsong Tizen Niji. was trying, the Buddhist piece where he is comparing Thurman's crown that is placed over our heads with the Buddhist crown. And it's a powerful, powerful piece. I would encourage that. So interreligious dialogue and practice. What I'm discovering, unconcealing about Thurman for me is that he was so hungry for this.
Mm-hmm.
His heart was like a gaping mouth, like a little bird, you know, when they first hatch, they are so hungry. The hunger of the heart, he borrows that, I believe, from Olive Schreiner, if I'm correct, but the hunger of the heart was real for Thurman. And I think he was able to keep his appetite until the very last days. And so I tried to introduce this idea around the metaphor of hunting. He's on a search for this sometimes elusive God, whom when he thinks he's caught God has gone somewhere else. And but at the same time, I think it's a heart of spirituality. The spiritual quest is to remain hungry, and hungry enough to be fed. Never satisfied with quick answers about God, solutions, formula, whether they are Christian formula or any other formula. God is always beyond and calling us to greater possibilities within ourselves and in relationships with others. So a huge discovery and rediscovery for me is this hunger of the heart that Thurman invites us to be involved in.
Yes.
The hunger of which you just spoke, Walter, I think is also accompanied by what you indicated to be his openness that he hasn't gotten everything right.
Right.
that this is not conclusive. And so it's a seeking that is characterized by humility, which is intriguing, I think, in the religious realm in terms of Thurman is speaking about being intimate with God. And at times he speaks about the mind of God being my mind and all of these matters. And one could misinterpret Thurman in terms of that kind of language to assume that Thurman is claiming not just an experience of God, but basically having captured God in some way out of that experience, or domesticated God, which is farthest from wherever Thurman was. It was humility that I think led Thurman to always be asking, I think, more questions than declarations he would make. And yet, the one certainty I feel Thurman had in this seeking, the one certainty Thurman had in the midst of all of these questions is the certainty of God's loving presence with him and with us. And it's out of that certainty that he could express confusion, he could express doubt, he could express uncertainty in ways that are, I think, authentic, as Thurman understood it, to the mind of Jesus.
You know, I would add to that, playing with that, realizing there's so many ways in which people frame or quick, I would say, sound bites of who Thurman is. I mean, we've all participated in it. Thurman is a mystic. Thurman is a theologian. He talks about the religious life. He presents on the mystical life. Here we just talked about him being living a life of the hunter, of the seeker. And one of the aspects that I find more and more that we have to pick up on, not that I'm a biblical scholar who likes these things, but really recognizing the interpretive life is a part of this. So Thurman's curiosity, Thurman's humility, Thurman constantly on this hunting and seeking and sort of process of revision, that working paper that he talks about, really, and the fact that he's led more by the questions and the certainties and declarations, that it really is the habit and practice of interpreting. He is always engaged in interpreting life, what is meaningful and significance. It's so much so that literally the phrase meaning and significance saturates, it's a consistent thread that comes up in many of his writings. It's like he's consumed with constantly wrestling with matters of meaning and significance, which means he is constantly in the practice of interpreting life and the cues of life, be it in nature, be it in relationship with people, be it his own experiences, be it the stories of the women in his life that formed him and shaped him and keep him anchored even later on in life. He has devoted himself to the interpretive life.
So a few months ago, Walter and I were talking about something, and we realized that maybe Thurman's favorite word is quest. And we looked at the titles of his sermons and sermon series: The Quest for God, The Quest for Community, The Quest for Maturity. I think we came up with 15 different quests that Thurman went on. And it all comes down, I think, to one basic quest, which I think both Luther and Shively spoke to. And it is a connection to God and a connection to the sort of numinous presence that was so important to him. But I think what was always key for Thurman is he wanted everybody to find their own God. That is absolutely key to what he was doing. And he says somewhere, if somebody tells you what your God is, it's not a real God. You have to find your own God. And that's why I think people from different religious backgrounds realized this purpose. And I think it's a modern notion that everybody, it's the responsibility of the individual to find themselves and to find their relation to deeper spiritual values. And I think it's also political on some level, that everybody is different, everybody is unique, and it's the role of democracy and community to bring us together without effacing our differences. And that is, once again, a huge challenge is still ongoing, and Thurman can speak to all these issues.
Yeah.
Ryan, he was so fascinated with this kind of fluidity of experience, and he would often quote Browning. He said, I shall arrive, by what time, what circuit first, I ask not, unless God sends fireballs, sleet, or stifling snow. And sometime in God's own good time, I shall arrive. He guides me and the bird in his own good time. He loved that.
Yeah.
And it was more bodily than whatever we call spirit. He could smell it. So the idea of smelling it, the scent of it, the sound of it for Thurman, the bodily moods, expressions are all part of this deep, deep hunger, this quest.
I love it because, Walter, and what you're saying, the need to read Thurman, appreciating the sensory richness of his writings, that Thurman's unfolding and knowing is articulated not just through words, but literally through the activation of the senses. Even in his writing, he wants us in encountering him, either in written form or even listening to him. He wants us to smell something. He wants us to see something. He wants us to hear something. He wants us to picture something in his mind. And so metaphors become really useful for him, because he's always on the hunt, recognizing he can never catch anything. And it's almost like he's taking takers, saying, won't you join me? Won't you join me in this adventure in which we will never catch what we're after?
Shively, I want to pull that thread just a little bit, and you know, I'm capturing this imagery, and it's so rich with imagery of joining Thurman on the hunt, joining Thurman on this pursuit. If you all had to say, what is one characteristic or habit that we are to cultivate internally, or maybe even in our communities, that will be the engine that drives us to join Thurman on that pursuit, especially in the midst of a world that is deeply broken and is filled with setbacks and grief and trauma? What is it that we need to cultivate to join Thurman on this search for common ground?
I I keep on my wall a plaque that actually came from Thurman's residence. It's a gift, and it's a statement of Thurman's where he says, "The signature of God is all around us."
Mm.
And Thurman, I think, is continually imploring us to pay attention to that which is before us and around us and beyond us. You see it in nature, as Walter referenced. You see it in relationships. You find it in scripture. It comes through the questions. It comes through the times of silence. There are all of these ways in which the evidence of God's imprint upon creation is in our midst. And we will miss it if we are failing to attune ourselves to truly engage it and appreciate it, and not try to either manipulate it or control it, but to understand it and to translate it into the ways in which we are relating to nature, we are relating to one another, we are relating to ourselves, because this signature is also with us. It's this kind of acute awareness and attentiveness that is a discipline. It's more than an attitude. It's a discipline that doing it once or twice is insufficient. But to take the variety of ways in which we come to attention to life is also the way in which we come to attention to God.
Mm.
Real quick, for me, I think one of the habits, in addition to just assuming the interpretive life, which I mentioned earlier, is really appreciating Thurman's, and we've talked about this posture of generous listening with wonder. I mean, Thurman actually says, when you listen to him, some of his sermons and lectures here and meditations, even, he'll say, I wonder, right? And that becomes an opening phrase in some of his meditations, I wonder. And I think that that's so important, that his wonderment is often fueled, informed, and playing with a posture of listening to all the sources, all the people, himself, listening to the world in its many different forms, as well as presence, that big P, presence, that is important to be accompanied by wonder and curiosity and humility.
Well, as opposed to my three distinguished panelists, I am not a theologian. And I'm not usually in the habit of talking much about God or how to find God. But I would say this, that Thurman, as Luther and Shively said, emphasized the nearness of the quest. That he always encouraged people, don't expect, he was a mystic, but he wasn't the sort of mystic that had like overpowering revelation from God that struck him dead and left him on the floor, and that you can read about. That he kept on saying, look for small things in silence, in conversation, in nature. And if you're attentive, you could find it. Just quickly, I think Thurman's connection to Quakerism was very important in
That's right.
And, you know, Thurman from the late 30s on was writing about nature and the way in which you can find God in nature and the way that humans have messed up and screwed up the natural world. And it goes together. I mean, I think throughout Thurman with the search for self-discovery, I think he was very worried often about people thinking that his way to spiritual discovery had to be their way. And he was always very careful to encourage people to find their way. He did not give answers to people, I think, just for that reason, that he didn't want to cut off or limit people's own spiritual journeys and quests.
Ryan, I'm aware of time. I'll simply make this statement. Like Luther, I have one of his little cards from the Howard Thurman Educational Trust, and it's the meditation, which is in, I believe, Meditations of the Heart. Keep open the door of your heart.
Yeah.
Keep open the door of your heart, because there's nothing that you can ever do to me if I keep open the door of my heart that will literally wipe me out, because I'm more powerful when my heart is open, when I'm empathetic, when I'm offering respect and even reverence for dignity and worth of the other. My heart is an open door. It's something I often say, and that's directly from Thurman. And out of this heart issues the streams of life. That's somewhere in the Bible. I know it's in the Bible.
Well, I love this, how you all are painting this picture of what drives Thurman and what might drive us in a similar search. I want to turn now to a few comments and questions from our audience. And for those in the audience, I invite you to continue to put through your questions, comments, ideas in the chat. We really do want to hear from you and want our panelists to interact with your ideas. And the one question that's highlighted here on your screen, the question is about whether you understand Thurman to have this idea that we always need to be looking with a fresh lens every moment. We're not, if I'm understanding correctly, not to be taking for granted that we understand or that we have arrived at the right framework. Is this how you all understand what Thurman is doing and what he's inviting us into as well?
I think this being alert to the wonder of life around us and within us is certainly what Thurman is about. And it's not in terms of reaching definitive conclusions about whatever the engagement is. I mean, sometimes I think Thurman's word that best characterizes the nature of his experience is, that's the best he can do in terms of and it's so fitting. It's not in any sense a deficient expression. In fact, to try and somehow or another weave the fabric that would capture the meaning of the experience is not the point. But if we miss the it may be that we've missed it. If we've moved immediately to, in some sense, trying to translate what we've experienced with meanings that, yes, they can be important and they can be responsive to the search, but if we miss that which is awe-inspiring, something that we're going to have to stay with beyond the experience itself, we will, I think, in some sense, fail to take seriously what it means to not just be alive to newness, but to have ourselves to be taken by it.
Right. And I think that's one reason why Thurman tend to be suspicious of formal theology.
That's right. That
the key was the experience. And when you start trying to describe it or talking about it, you've already been removed from it. And the point is to have the experience, and as Luther said, go and not create a whole edifice based on it, but just to live it.
Mm.
Always being aware that all of these constructions of God, of piety, are artificial, his language, are ultimately artificial. And one of the ways he talks about this is he says, it is the experience of experience to experience itself. and we have this experience of God, Jacob running from his brother. And we build our altar there because we met God at this place. And God has already left the building. And we're there still worshiping at this altar. And this is Thurman's idea of spirit. And it doesn't mean that analytical tools are not important. No, 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 that history is not important. And understanding one's religious tradition is not important. But to be aware that at its best, it's ultimately artificial, as an artifice, artificial.
The second question I want to lift up, and thank you all for your responses to that, has to do with how do we begin to engage younger generations on the work of Howard Thurman, right? And I want to bring that, it might be younger, of course, one's interpretation of what younger means is open for some debate, but I might even say, how do we even teach kids about Howard Thurman, even tweens and teens, those who might not be ready for the whole swath of his work? How do we start that conversation and introduce them?
Yeah, I think I'd like to lead off on this as someone who sort of I've experimented with with this question in some ways. One thing I would say up front in answer to your question, Ryan, is to say that Thurman can be encountered at all ages. And that is really important now, particularly at this period and moving forward, the way in which the generations now that can encounter Thurman have to encounter him in his writings. But we do have audio libraries of Thurman that are available. And I think that there is something really lost. And I kind of point to this actually in my essay about, I think there's something lost by the commitment to only read Thurman, because you actually catch the spirit and some of these clues that we're talking about, not in his cleaned up version, published versions of his meditations and so forth. It is in the false starts that you hear in him actually speaking that creates the and the pauses and disrupts some of the, I would say, sense that to be spiritual means to have it all pristine and right. I mean, Thurman has a lot of false starts when he's talking this stuff out, right? And those false starts create pauses. How do you introduce this to tweens and teens? You let them listen to Thurman. Now, they can't listen to all of Thurman because it might put them to sleep. But I mean, really, the living words of Thurman, let those children listen to Thurman tell the story of, in every person there is a sea, and on that sea there is an island, and on that island let them hear this 1 minute description that Thurman gives of the sea, the altar, the angel with the flaming sword, and you ask them, what do you see? Right? And you use that to take them on this journey of discovery. Those are wonderful opportunities to bring Thurman forward in the current moment and to begin to seed him in the next generation at the level of their imaginations and their encounters.
Our next question. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Dr. Fluker, please.
Thurman is filled. Anybody who dares to look at Thurman, he's filled with play, with references to children's stories. Yes. The stories are just layered. And even Thurman and Sue Bailey Thurman, who deserves full credit every time we call his name, they actually wrote a children's story, Peter the Penguin. And one of the products of the Howard Thurman Papers Project was Kai Issa Jackson's book, a children's book on Thurman, Howard Thurman's Big Dream. So there are examples and ways in which we can make this happen for young adults, but even for children, for young children.
I would just want to add that Thurman was deeply into the arts and found in the arts that which raises our spirits to levels that have taken us to ecstatic experience at times. And how we might make use of the arts in, I think, introducing not just Thurman, but the concepts about which Thurman, I think, has been so devoted, could be really important. Dance and instrumentals and song are all, I think, powerful matters. But I would also add, my experience with youth has been that there are many of them who welcome being mentored in how to engage silence and a different rhythm. They're so used to people seeking to translate everything with a sort of MTV approach of, every 5 seconds, a different image. And it can miss, I think, the kind of formation that would be long-term, not just in terms of engaging Thurman, but engaging the disciplines that help them to center down in the midst of life.
Dr. Fluker, I want to pose you this next question. Drew West asks about the inner life, the personal life of Thurman, and whether he was known to be actively involved in spiritual disciplines such as fasting. Did he live more of a contemplative lifestyle? I wonder if you might just shed some light on what you might know about the inner spiritual life of Thurman.
And I'll invite my colleagues to join me, but I don't know of any reference where Thurman said he fasted. He loved food, all kinds of food, especially wild game. And he would store coffee for days and come back to the same pot. I mean, he loved food. So, and it showed in many different ways. But so I'm not sure, but he was very attentive to the notion of commitment and what the commitment that one makes calls one to be and do. He's not against fasting or spiritual disciplines. He writes a book on it. And detachment is a very important feature of Thurman's writings. But he's very suspect of any monolithic, singular way, right way to meet God. So some might meet God fasting. I would say this for Thurman. Others might meet God in the incredible food of the feast that is set before them. I don't think Thurman wants to be labeled. Inner life for Thurman, it shows up everywhere. But mainly, I think, in his prayers. At the beginning of his sermon, or at the end of the sermon, or in the midst of a sermon, you hear Luther's awe, but you also hear Thurman struggling in presence. And it's most revelatory, and I mentioned this in the last article, I think, in the book, my article, is most evident when Thurman is seeking a response or an answer to a question that he just can't get right in public space. So he's there praying while everybody is watching. Talking about intimate and being exposed, boy, you could do a lot with that figure. Make it before God. That's my point.
Thurman, I think, was a very private person, and which is sort of like a handicap for a biographer, because biographers are always nosy. They want to know every possible detail about the subject. But Thurman kept a lot of things private, and I think it was personal, but I think it goes to the question, and what Walter was saying is that he did not want his own spiritual practices to become models for other people. That whatever he did, he wanted to keep it to himself his sermons gave hints, suggestions for how people could do it, but he would, as somebody said, he was not an answer man. And I just want to double, second what Shively says is the best way to understand Thurman is to listen to his sermons and not just to read his books. Though, if I can give a little advertisement, Walter and I have published the 4th volume is coming out from Orbis Press that published Walter's book of Thurman's sermon series, and we have tried to keep some of the false starts, to keep some of the improvisatory quality of the sermons as we publish. And so so it's important to listen to them, but I think we've tried in a new way to capture some of the freeness of sermons, sermon giving.
Friends, I'm afraid we have time for just one more question, and our response to it might be brief. Must be brief in light of the hour. But Jim Hammond asks and notes that we live in a time where our communities are arguably fractured and separated more than ever, perhaps making the search for common ground more difficult than ever. The question is, what suggestions based on the work of Thurman do you suggest for encouraging groups to seek mutual acceptance, especially at such a time as this?
I think Shively ought to answer this.
Amen.
Thank you. I think, to be honest, I think when we think about what it means to cross the great divides that are socially a part of us, and that really is playing off of Thurman's own autobiography, it is the action of crossing the divides. It is to make the conscious decisions that, yes, we are siloed and separate, and quite frankly, we are in a world and in a moment in which it is very easy to stay in our echo chambers, and to make the decision that we are going to cross anyway, right? And to cross anyway is to take the risk of censure, to take the risk of rejection, to take the risk of what it means to be vulnerable, what it means to learn something new, to be challenged, to sit with the discomfort of disagreement. But for me, it is to learn from Thurman is to learn that we must cross. Wow.
Let me just say, I think for Thurman, both traditional religion and traditional communities had a lot of their power from excluding. From people who were not included you felt special. And I think both for religion and community, the goal of Thurman was to create the intense sense of togetherness that religion and community creates without excluding people, and having and without weakening community because it's universal. And I think it's a very difficult combination, but I think it's at the center of religion and community for Thurman that they have to be permeable. And Thurman says at the end of the Search for Common Ground that a community that's not open will devour itself. And I think it's absolutely key for, I think, the question that was asked today, and we're still very much searching for it.
Well, that is a great word to end on, a word of hope, a word that I think Thurman himself would invite us to end on. Friends, it has been rich time of conversation. You see my little teaching assistant in the background there. It is time to wrap. It's been a rich conversation. Thank you all for being here. For our attendees, we're so grateful that you are here. Remember, there's a coupon code for the book. We encourage you to buy the book as your pursuit and journey with Thurman continues. There's so many questions and comments we haven't gotten to. We're sorry for that, but we are grateful for the interaction. And to our panelists and to our editor, Dr. Fluker, thank you for sharing not just your wisdom and insight, but really your passion and commitment to the work of Thurman. We are grateful for you, friends. If you're interested in other webinars like this, you can join the Candler Foundry for future publications. You can check out our website at candlerfoundry.emory.edu to not only find out about upcoming webinars, but also to find out more about our courses, our certificate program, our TheoEd talks, and other resources that we offered that we hope will bring the Academy, the church, and the community together in rich conversations. Friends, be well, thank you, and have a wonderful night.